The following program contains strong language and the discussion includes themes of suicide and mental ill health. Listener discretion is advised.
Kia ora, I'm Claire Finlayson, Program Director of the Dunedin Writers and Readers Festival. The 2019 festival recording you're about to hear was brought to you with funding from a Copyright Licensing New Zealand grant and with the support of OAR FM. This session, The Galloping Mind, featuring Naomi Arnold, Ashleigh Young and Wendy Parkins, was chaired by Charlotte Graham-McLay and presented by the Otago University Press. Enjoy.
Kia ora tātou katoa, ko Charlotte Graham-McLay tōku ingoa, and I am thrilled to warmly welcome all of you, and perhaps delightfully more people than I might have expected at 10 on a Saturday morning, to this Dunedin Writers and Readers Festival event, beautifully titled The Galloping Mind and presented by Otago University Press. I might say now, and then I might mention as well at the end, that if you're listening to some of what we're talking about today and you think, oh wow, I think that might be me, and you want to talk to someone, you can actually call 0800 Anxiety, this is true, to get connected to services via the New Zealand Anxiety Trust. And there's also a national mental health helpline that you can text by sending a message to 1737. But I'll mention that again at the end just in case anything's come up for anyone. But we hear statistics about mental health, and it seems like we're not always good at picturing the actual human face of it, knowing what the intense fear of anxiety is like. And that's something that the writers and editors we have here today do so well in their work. Mental health is something that has never been more discussed, but stigma remains. Talking about it at work, talking about it with your family, the way it's covered in the news, and the fact that even though we now encourage people, exhort people to reach out for help, help is not always readily available to those who ask. But how much of that social debate are we obliged to carry into our creative practice? And can we write about anxiety without sounding like a public service announcement? Well, we have 3 writers on stage with me today who can and do, but I will introduce everyone that we have here now. Naomi Arnold is the editor of a groundbreaking book in New Zealand, and actually I'd say a groundbreaking book probably anywhere, called Headlands, New Stories of Anxiety, which collects stories, experience and articulations of anxiety from a whole range of people, writers and non-writers alike. She's an award-winning journalist. She has hosted podcasts, reviewed books and coordinated the Readers and Writers program at the Nelson Arts Festival. Ashleigh Young writes some of the most vivid and precise poetry and prose describing the inside of her head, which she weaves with history, the natural world, and other people's behaviour. I love it very much. She has a new book of poems out this week, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thursday.
You sound surprised. It's called How I Get Ready, and she previously wrote the award-winning essay collection, Can You Tolerate This? She's a book editor and fairly recently a newspaper columnist.
Yes, yeah.
Wendy Parkins has, I think, the most recently released book by a hair. The wonderfully titled Every Morning So Far I'm Alive was launched last night, so you can be among the first to own one if you grab one after the session today. It's an honest and searching memoir about how and why to stay alive in the face of anxiety and her own experiences of depression and obsessive compulsive disorder. It's shot through with literature, and Wendy is a former professor of Victorian literature teaching at universities in New Zealand, Australia and the UK. Please join me in welcoming all of them to the stage. I wondered, before we actually get into the writing, if perhaps each of you could talk first of all about, before you started writing about mental health and especially writing about your own mental health, how open were you about it with people that you knew? Is it something that you think people would have known about you? And I know, Naomi, you've written about your husband's mental health as well. Is that something that people would have known about the two of you? Yeah.
Us.
Yeah.
Yeah, my husband was pretty bad actually. So he was suicidal, trigger warning. So he he had a marriage breakup, which led to a lot of issues for him that resulted in anxiety and depression and, suicidal ideation. So he pretty much had to quit his job and get well, which took about 3 or 4 years. So I think everyone kind of knew what was going on, and he was having terrible panic attacks, just, daily, couldn't leave the house type situation. So I think people knew, and actually one of the worst things was that people got a bit sick of it because it had been years and years that it went on for. So some friends and family sort of withdrew, and he sort of couldn't get the support that he needed because no one really knew what was going on. No one really knew what a panic attack was or how to deal with it, and people just sort of said those pop psychology things like, I don't know, attention seeking and, all those phrases that people use to diminish mental health problems. So he was very much, it was quite obvious that there was, things were going on wrong with him. My anxiety sort of happened in tandem with his because neither of us were sleeping and it was extremely stressful. And I don't think I'd always been kind of a highly strung person, I think, but that was one of those things, those words that your grandmother uses to describe you. It doesn't really, my nana, I remember saying, you're always a tense child. But I don't know if people sort of realise that means sometimes that can deepen into some quite severe mental health problems. So I don't know if people knew that I was having issues. I did quit my job as well and went freelancing, but so we could manage the time and sleep better. But yeah, I don't think we were that open about it because people hadn't really responded that well to him.
How about for you, Ashleigh? Before your essay collection came out, was it something that you had talked to people about?
With a very select few. But even then, I was quite selective. I was also wary of just boring people and wearing out my welcome, sort of using up all of their emotional bandwidth, which is the phrase that gets bandied around. I was often wary of really alarming people when it was very bad, because I sort of thought that that's a huge weight to put on someone. So I didn't speak to my parents about it at all, for instance. It's only a couple of months ago that I actually talked to them directly about it. And my dad told me to take some rescue remedy. And I sort of thought, maybe I need to look elsewhere. Some support.
So how did that work so you wrote this book of essays, it was very well received here in New Zealand, but then it wins a major international prize. You're going to book festivals all over the world to talk about it. Sometimes your parents are coming to watch you talk about it at events. And then 2 months ago you have the first conversation about it. Was that awkward at all?
It really was.
Yeah.
In my family, we're very good at talking around things to a profound extent. And I mean, I think it's sort of an open secret in our family that we all struggle, and yet none of us are very good at reaching out to one another. Maybe with the exception of my brothers and I have a great relationship, which has been hugely meaningful and helpful to me. But yeah, it's funny because on one hand I have this impulse now to write, well, maybe not about it, but to let it be in my writing in various ways. I think anyone who knows me, it is quite evident a lot of the time that I do struggle with these things. But early on, I put a lot of pressure on myself to just maintain a calm and collected presence, and I think that made things worse ultimately. But really that headlines piece was maybe the second or third essay I'd written that more directly spoke about it. But even with that, I was nervous. I think there's this illusion that sort of what we confess to is who we are, and especially in New Zealand, I think. That's related to the stigma that's still around these things, but and so I was worried that I'd just sort of be dismissed as a nutter, which, at times I definitely feel like I have been. I've felt unsafe and just completely chaotic and unhinged. But you're still a person who has things to contribute, obviously. So it's something I probably will always write about, or it'll always be there, because it's not something you ever completely resolve ever. I think it's continuing to manage it.
I'd love to delve a bit more into some of those deliberate essays a bit later on, but I would love to put the same question to you, Wendy, because you have just written a book-length memoir that shows how interwoven your mental health and mental illness was with all of the other parts of your life. That's drawn together really beautifully. I was saying to you earlier, I read your book and wanted to move to Matakana because she writes the most beautiful, poetic kind of natural world writing about the scenery and the birds and all this stuff, and then also, obsessive compulsive disorder. It seems like people would have known for you that there was something going on, perhaps, but how much did you feel like you could talk about it verbally in the same way that you've ended up talking about it in your writing?
Well, I think that similar to what other people have said, I wasn't very open about it generally, and the job that I had, having to regularly lecture to hundreds of students, and there's a real sort of public dimension to that sort of academic job, and I was holding quite a senior position, so I needed to sort of perform on a daily basis, and I managed a lot of the time to compartmentalize things so that I could perform when I needed to, and then sort of go home and fall apart. And particularly anyone who knows anything about the behaviours associated with OCD and the sort of rituals involved, part of the way that those rituals function is to try to enable you to keep functioning in a certain way, and to a certain degree. So there's also, and I describe some of the ways of sort of masking the OCD stuff. And so I think I had become pretty expert at how to fall apart but keep things on the surface, looking like things were okay if you didn't look too closely.
As a reader, because your book delves into so much of the literature in kind of memoir genre around mental health, were you kind of peering into the faces of these memoirists, kind of looking for people who were like you, who were functional and holding down a job, and were you looking for accounts of people who had managed to seemingly hold it together?
I think it's a bit like, when you're pregnant, suddenly you realise the world is full of pregnant women. That's all you see. And so it was, whatever I read, I would think that, I think they're really suffering from OCD. You start to develop a radar for it, and whether that's kind of wishful thinking. And also, as someone whose life revolves around literature, you do very much, I felt very drawn to writers like Virginia Woolf and Sylvia Plath, even at the same time thinking it's such a cliche, Every woman who feels she's slightly unhinged thinks that she might secretly be Virginia Woolf, under the right circumstances, and maybe, and that whole sort of genius madness thing, which is so powerful and can be very enabling but also very disabling. So it was more that whatever I read, I could see links, and some things that I found really nourishing and helpful and sustaining, and other things that kind of flagged that this was a slippery slope, that things could get even worse. So it was more that sort of general, the world of literature presents that to you in various ways, rather than, I did read a lot of memoirs of other people who'd been through breakdowns, and some of them were great and some of them I found really boring. But it was that sense of wanting to find whatever you could to draw on, and to, shed some light on what you were experiencing, because it can be so isolating.
Mm-hmm. Did anyone have like a predicating incident that made them think, I actually want to write about this now, or in the case of you, Naomi, I think I'm going to collate an entire book of stories about anxiety. Was there something that gave you a push or a boost or a...
That idea came after we'd got through the worst of it. And I just wonder if, looking back on it, it was sort of... because while we were in it, I wrote a few personal essays about what we were going through while sort of being in it, which led people, I hear now, say, is Naomi okay? You know, like around various friend groups around the country.
Did they say it to you or just to each other?
They're telling me now that they were saying it to each other. So people are talking about me, awesome. But I just wasn't aware of what was going on while I was in it, and so I wrote a few things and then sort of came to regret those later because they were a bit too sort of open or whatever. But the book idea came after we'd been through everything and we were actually just sick of it. We were sick of talking about it, we were sick of therapy, we were sick of the Google links, you know, and you know, the books and have you tried this and this, and it was a way to look outwards at what other people had gone through. So it was like once we're done with the internal stuff, it's like, okay, well, what is this like? What is this thing? Because we didn't really know what anxiety was until, even going through the book, I started to realise what anxiety was. You know, as all the essays came in, I started to get a better idea of what it was. So it was very much, we're done with ourselves, we're sick of ourselves, and what is this thing like for other people? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure if there was a predicating event as such, but I mean, not to be too maudlin, but at my lowest, I just felt very, very isolated and alone. And I think part of that was the effect of being very selective with the things I told people I was close to. And I just had this real craving to reach out. And the only way I knew how to do that was in writing. And so, I just started very slowly in a very oblique manner, but it started to feel a little safer as I went. And I was really astonished by how kind people were. You know, I wasn't savaged or it was, and it sort of gave me courage in other parts of my life as well to just reveal a little bit more. I think the thing with anxiety and depression as well, of course, is that it makes your world feel incredibly small and the world feel incredibly overwhelming. Often there's this, I started reading this book by Eckhart Tolle, who's like this quite famous spiritual teacher. It's the one called The Power of Now, and his theory was that feelings like anxiety and fear and apprehension, they're all kind of an accumulation of too much future, whereas feelings like grief and remorse and guilt are all accumulations of too much past and not enough present. But I actually felt like my anxiety was too much present. Like, it was far too much present, just flooding in and assaulting me. And maybe writing about it just allowed me to not only to frame it, but also to move out into the world a little bit more. One of the other things that really helped me was going on long walks and taking really bad photos of flowers and bees on the flowers. Like it just something about that simple task really quieted my mind and just allowed me to manage the world for a short period of time, and then I could withdraw again like a snail and feel that I'd been out in the world for a brief moment. Yeah.
I did have a predicating event, and I describe it in the book that after I'd really hit rock bottom, when for me it was really overwhelming depression, and I couldn't read. You know, it was very difficult trying to teach when I couldn't read anything. I couldn't read a newspaper article. I just could not focus on a page in front of me, and that was just that was as devastating as the depression, because that is sort of a big part of my identity. Give me something to read and I just feel alive, and that's where I'm at home if I'm reading a book. So, and I describe in the memoir, when I realised I needed help and started to try, while I was living in England, to access different kinds of therapy and trying different approaches. And the first point of call was medication. And for anybody who is familiar with the sort of SSRI medication, you'll know that it takes it can take quite a while to kick in. So after several months, I felt that I could start to read again, and at the same time, but very slowly, I was referred to a therapist whose big thing was narrative. And he used to talk about, life is a journey. So every session he would, in the book I call him the journeyman, because every session was life is a journey, tell me about your journey, where have you been, where are you going? And I think now I would, just have that reaction instantly, but he was actually the best person that I'd seen for several months. So I did stick with him for a while, and he kept saying, tell me about your narrative. And finally, I had enough of him, but also thought, right, I'm going to write my narrative. I'm not going to share it with you because you're an idiot. But I'm going to go home and I'm going to start writing this story. And I really did start because I felt that certainly professionally, nobody was listening to me and nobody was helping. So I would just tell myself this story and take it from there. And it really was very literally became a form of self-help. I was helping myself through writing the story. So it very much was writing it while I was still immersed in it, because it took several years to write. So I sort of came out the other end and was still writing it. But it very much started when I was in the middle of it and not knowing if I was going to recover properly.
I might jump on that point about therapy, because all three of your books have depictions of what it is like to go to therapists or counsellors or to be in therapy. And in fact, you have a story in yours about going to someone and you say something like, almost immediately I knew it was a mistake. And I snorted with delight in a cafe, because we've all been there. But because we do not talk about therapy at all in the society and what it's meant to be like, you as an anxious person think, oh, I'm terrible at therapy as well. Everything else, this is all on me. And some therapists are just not very good at their jobs. But I didn't know that for years. I blamed myself. I thought I was immune to therapy. So can you talk a bit about how deliberately those decisions were to either write or to show in your books what the acts of actually getting help might look like, whether it's helpful help or non-helpful help?
Well, one of the things I worried about with my book was that on reflection, therapy doesn't come out of it very well. And maybe if I'd had better therapy, I wouldn't have written the book. But the problem with that is that, this was not my first breakdown. This is not my first time at the rodeo, as Americans like to say. And in previous breakdowns, I'd had some excellent therapy, and I had some really good, I'd done some very good sort of programs, and I had some really incredibly wise, compassionate therapists. This time around, I just lucked out. I don't know whether that was being in England, and then, part of it was back in New Zealand. I didn't have a very successful experience here either. But I just, for whatever reason, couldn't find it. So there's one thing that worries me, that the book might give a sort of negative view of therapy, and that I would say that's only that phase of my life, but earlier experiences were quite literally life-saving. So it's a mixed bag, but I think that's important for people to know that it's not them, it might be the therapist. And that's why now I can walk into a therapist's office and I can know straight away if this is going to work or not, because I've seen a few.
Was that something that you were really trying to get a range of experiences across in Headlands? Because it's not just people talk about therapy, they talk about even down to specific medications, which is really cool. Like, this is what citalopram's like, this is what this is like. Was that a very conscious editing decision for you?
Not so much. Because we were on the editorial team, there was sort of 4 or 5 of us who were working on it and gathering them and editing them and dealing with the 32 writers. So that getting a broad range of experiences was really important in terms of not all having the same demographic of person writing about therapy. It was because there's a whole range of ways that people deal with what they've got in there, and definitely a range of therapy experiences. Paula Harris's piece talks about a therapist who was sort of a psychotherapist really, like a medical, who was so bad for her that he committed her, is that the word? Sectioned her, and that was devastating for her. She ended up in, the secure unit, thinking, what just happened? But she's now with someone who she loves and is really good for her. So, even accessing the therapy is difficult because obviously it costs $130 or whatever to go to someone, and then to get referred can take months and months or years to even get through that barrier to actually see someone on the health system.
Did you encourage people to be specific though?
Not really. It was pretty much all I said to them was just tell us, go away and write inside. It was, we want to know what's going on inside your head and also how that fits within the wider social scene of anxiety and mental health and what you've experienced out in the world. I think I said writing inside and outside your head, or I had some phrase. So we just said go away and write about it, 2,000 words, and they came back and they had all these amazing, it was amazing. Just they brought all these different things back and we were just kind of gobsmacked, just getting them in and thinking, oh, this is incredible, they've just let loose. And then a lot of them, people then retracted or didn't want to do it, or we had to rearrange stuff, and there are a few people who just got to the last minute and said, I just can't do this because it was too much. But it was.
Tell me about that. How did you deal with that process?
There are a few people I really, really wish who had gone through with it, but for whatever reason that they couldn't at that time. But
what was it that they were worried about?
Well, specifically one woman, she was writing from a Māori perspective about health, and she didn't feel safe in the end because she was still learning about how the Māori world saw mental health, and she didn't want to represent it to everyone. She felt like a representative of being Māori, and that's one of the themes that came through in the book was that people feel like if they're in there, they're saying this is the only way that my culture is with this thing, and that they felt that burden very strongly. So she wanted to work with a Māori co-editor quite early on to sort of to work through those issues, but she didn't sort of want to do it with a bunch of Pākehā editors, which is fair enough. But she's still writing. She's a brilliant writer, so she's still exploring it on her own terms. But so that was one thing, and then other people. I think I ended up having about 100 people or 70 people that we were talking with, and then we got about 42 in, and then chose 32 writers, 31 essays. So a lot of people we just never heard from them. I would email, call. Hi, how are you going? Hi, just checking in to see, and just nothing. And we never heard from them again, and they probably feel awful about it.
And I was about to say, they are still thinking about that now.
Yeah.
That's interesting because in terms of the representation of stories of anxiety, again, to break the fourth wall a moment, probably everyone on the stage is who you would think of as the kind of mainstream idea of someone who has anxiety. You know what I mean? Not to put too fine a point on it. It's not like we're not super representative.
Yeah.
And in some ways it is, even though it's still hard, it is easier for people who look and appear a certain way to tell those stories.
Yeah.
And I know that's something you found a real challenge. Do you think there are things you could have done at the outset of that project to get a more diverse range of stories?
Yeah, I didn't realise, I was pretty ignorant, to be honest, about how anxiety manifests in different segments of the population, because I really only had my experience and my white friends' experience. And then we'll go into that a little bit in the introduction, but one of someone I approached who was, I think she's of Chinese and Korean descent, said, the only people I know who have anxiety, all my friends are anxious, but the only people I know who are on psychiatric medication are my white friends. Everyone else sort of dealt with it within their own cultures in certain ways. And Ricky Gooch has a really great interview with Kirsten McDougall in there where he says if he didn't have his position of being a top musician in New Zealand with Trinity roots, he would be in prison or dead because being a Māori man, he's from Dunedin, isn't he? Yeah, he just didn't feel, well, it's not that he didn't feel, it's that it was difficult for him to access that care because of, because of everything. So it took the poet Glenn Colquhoun to say to him, I think you have mental health problems, or, go and see this doctor. And Ricky says that he was very privileged in that way to actually have that access. So there's a whole, it's difficult for me to say as a Pākehā person, but there are a range of limiting factors that I really wasn't aware of when I started this about even labelling what they have. as anxiety or a mental illness, and then accessing care is a whole other thing. So, yeah, it was a good learning experience. And if I'd done it again, I would have done it with a Māori co-editor, or people I would have got a whole group of people. Yeah, because I didn't realise that people wouldn't feel sort of culturally safe submitting to a bunch of Pākehā publishers.
And you made the decision a wee way into that process to put out an active call for...
So not to just invite people, but
just please, everyone, just send me your stories of anxiety. And if that's you, because I emailed about 70 people of various writing persuasions and said, please pass this on to anyone you think may want to contribute. And if that's you, then please send us an essay too, because I sent it to a few people who thought might probably have anxiety.
Ashleigh, I want to ask you about your essay Ghost Knife, which is in Headlands, and it was published somewhere online, right?
Because it was picked up by The Cut, which is a sort of a magazine-y part of New York magazine. They actually edited it quite a bit in the end.
Okay.
But I think it's probably fine. Yeah,
they took probably fine.
They took out some bits that I quite was fond of, but it's
great. And I remember it must have been online because I remember reading it. It's an essay about a repetitive, violent, intrusive thought. And the kind of process that you went through to try and figure out what that was and why, basically, and what could be done about it. And I know it must have been online because I remember reading it in bed at 5 a.m. on my phone and kind of hissing to my husband when he woke up, Ashleigh Young's written an essay about my life. So I remember it was such a powerful read because it's one of those things that you don't hear talked about much. It's a specific subset of anxiety that you don't hear talked about. And I wondered with something like that, where you're talking about a very specific part of your anxiety, how you figure out what it is that you want to say about it and how you balance what you're wanting to say about this kind of anxiety with wanting the writing to be good. Do you know what I mean? Because every sentence you write is so deliberate and precise. What kind of negotiation were you going through when you were writing that?
Yeah, and maybe it's a slightly shallow response, but so that the repeating thought that I had was basically of a knife stabbing my face, and I still have this, but I sort of thought, well, that's a really interesting image. From a writer's perspective, I could describe that in a compelling way, and that's I felt conflicted about that. I sort of thought, am I exploiting this horrible thing this compulsive thought that I have, and making it sound interesting, and am I glamorizing this ridiculous thought? Anyway, I went with it. But it became something that I could hang a lot of discussion on, I suppose. But the essay is just me going to a lot of different specialists of various kinds and asking what they thought about it, with varying degrees of success. I'm not sure really if I arrived at any particular answer. I read a lot I became really interested in how intrusive thoughts and OCD have been understood and studied throughout history. So I read a lot of sort of early 20th century case studies of people with really just overwhelming intrusive thoughts. And in some cases that sort of fed into other things that I was writing. But I still feel a little bit conflicted about how I reduced a lot of things that were happening internally for me at the time down to this single image, and then tried to just understand that. In a way, I mean, I didn't want to overwhelm the reader. I also didn't want to alarm anyone who anyone I knew who may have been reading it. So, I got quite a few responses to it. I had one woman email me and say, it sounds like you need to have some past life therapy and some myofascial release.
That's good.
So, yeah, all these kinds of interesting suggestions.
Did you do anything?
No, well, in some cases I'd tried a lot of them.
Right, yeah.
People were saying, you just need a really good scalp massage.
So helpful.
Yeah. There were a lot of people who were quite dismissive, actually. They were like, this is what this is. You just need to do this. And, I found that interesting in itself. Just that people felt like it was easy to label what to me was a very overwhelming and disturbing, and it's something that makes me think, God, there's something profoundly wrong with me.
Yeah.
But going through the process of talking to lots of people about it definitely softened that fear.
And I think that was why it was so powerful. It was because it was the kind of thing that a lot of us obviously were sitting there thinking, well, that's the actual crazy thing that we should never tell anyone about.
Right.
And then you said it, so it was, so it was there. I wondered, this might lead into, there's been that debate in the past few years about personal essay and memoir, and it seems to have died down a bit now, but about whether there was a lot of kind of faux concern a few years ago about young people oversharing on the internet about their mental health, and whether there was any actual value in that as essay writing, or whether it was just, editors exploiting them for clicks or that sort of thing. But it seems like there is a value in experience, right? And like hearing about experience. And so I just wondered where you all came down on that, because we tell young writers that you can't write until you have something to say. You need to know, the question you're answering or what you're saying in this piece, or we give feedback that it doesn't really seem like what you're saying in this piece. And quite often with mental health, we don't know, right? So where do you sit in terms of the importance of having a clear kind of thesis or thing that you're saying versus the value of pure experience? I mean, for you as an academic, that must have been something you've thought about with your memoir, right?
I did think about it, but I also tried not to think about it. And it partly goes back to what I was saying before, that because I started to write it when I was in the midst of the experience, that I really, certainly until I was much further down the road to recovery, I wasn't sort of reflecting critically on it at all. I was just needed to write this down. And the more I wrote, because writing about it made me feel better than anything else I was doing. So I just wanted to keep writing. And it was only with sort of subsequent drafts, and when, I showed bits to a few friends and they encouraged me to turn it into a book. And I started to think, well, if it's a book, it has to have, a beginning, a middle and an end. And so that led to more of that reflection. But I guess it just was, I wanted to tell a story, but I didn't want it to be like a lot of memoirs I'd read, which, sort of miraculously about 2/3 of the way through they completely recover, and that was it. And I didn't think it was that tight. That wasn't my experience of it being that tidy, that you deal with these things and you have the treatment and then you live happily ever after. So I wanted there to be a kind of unresolved element to it, but I didn't want it to be bleak in that sense. So because you do want to, I did want to say that there is hope, but it's that balance, isn't it, between being honest about the experience and how awful it is and how some bits get better and other bits you just kind of learn to live with. So that sense of a kind of social responsibility that you have for anything that you publish, that goes out into the world, that's really hard. But I know that my feeling is that the more people write about mental health, the more different perspectives, the more different stories there are. We'll stop having, stop asking these kinds of questions, because it will just become part of this kind of very rich tapestry of here's this huge range of human experience of all these different forms of pain and suffering and ways that people have dealt with it. And hopefully individually we'll stop feeling such a burden like what will people take from my particular story? Because that story is just one of so many stories, which is why Headlands is such a valuable collection.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, I recently signed up to a journalist story collecting service that collects all of the work you've ever done and lists it for some sort of landing page for your, self-employed business. And there are about 700 articles, and a good proportion of those...
By you?
And a good proportion of those are columns I wrote about 6 or 7 years ago that I wish I could just wipe from the face of the earth because they're awful. And everything I thought was awful and dumb, how you think about yourself sort of 10 years ago. Some really stupid opinions, and I had also started exploring mental health in those and anxiety, and my first one was after I went paragliding and started blacking out. And then so I think we'd better land because I was sort of getting all circles and feeling sick and stuff. But that was my first sort of panic attack anxiety column. And I just really wish that just was not there anymore. But as a person who believes in everything being open and everyone talking about everything, basically, I still think it's valuable that it's sort of still there and I still did it. But you always regret writing about mental health, but you just kind of have to live with the fact that it's just there, and that was where you were at that time. And I think different things now, and I've matured a lot. And then in another 10 years, I will hate everything I'm writing now. So you just
always a great thought.
I mean, like you just have to. It's like your chapter heading, bloom where you're planted. Yeah, in your book. You just have to work with what you've got at the moment and then regret everything for the rest of your life. But it will speak to somebody at some point, Yeah. Even though I was an idiot in 2009. So.
Who wasn't? Weren't we all? Yeah.
I find this question tricky of, when there's a piece that has no... when there's a piece that has a lot of uncertainty and no resolution in it. I mean, on one hand, I can see the enormous value in people writing about their experiences. The reader in me always wants a story and wants a narrative, and mental illness often does not behave in that way. People's lives don't behave in that way. I keep thinking about this book I recently read called The Friend by Sigrid Nunez, and it doesn't... really overtly deal with anxiety, but the story is that the narrator, the novel is written as an address to a friend of hers who has killed himself, a professor. So it's a kind of epistolary project. She ends up taking in this Great Dane of his, this big old dog, in her tiny, tiny apartment. Very reluctantly. She's a cat person. She doesn't like how dogs demand devotion. She wants an animal that can take care of itself. But she has a great deal of fear and concern for this dog because the dog is grieving. It's howling at night, and obviously you can't explain to a dog what death is and that its owner is never coming back. So she has this concern for the dog that she can only communicate in a certain way. There's also, she acknowledges there's the reader's fear that something terrible is going to happen to the dog. And she talks about all these other novels where terrible things happen to the dog. And that was my fear reading, that we were just on the verge of some awful thing happening to the dog. But it never does. And there's just this great tenderness. And there's just a scene of her sort of grooming the dog and looking after it and as it's aging. I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, but I sort of I think it's the only novel I've read where the writer directly addresses the reader's anxiety for her characters, and somehow soothes them. Because often it goes the other way, you end up traumatised by, and I've read so many novels with dogs in them that have ended terribly to the point where if a dog appears in a book, I don't want to read it anymore. And
not just dogs, right? And that like with this conversation, that the number of books that have someone killing themselves as the climax 2/3 of the way through, and that comes out of nowhere, that it just seems like a shorthand for people in terms of a climax. I mean, Do you think when we're writing non-fictionally about these things, do you think there's a social responsibility? Or...
Yeah, I do. Yeah, and that's the burden that the writer has to take on. I mean, you have to understand your story is, obviously just one of many. But yeah, I mean, I think as Wendy was saying, the more stories there are, the easier it becomes for others to tell theirs. But yeah, I do see a bit of a shift away from confessional. I mean, I have problems with that word, but confessional first-person pieces that maybe 5 years ago there seemed to be just a plethora everywhere you looked. Every online platform had a special sort of "it happened to me" section. But I can't help but feel that what with climate change and Trump and Brexit, there's necessarily a moving outward and a looking outward, and people trying to make sense together of, maybe not together, of what's happening in our world and how we manage our own internal anxieties when we look at this chaos, basically. So yeah, I just sense a bit of a shift in writing about ourselves.
Yeah. Picking up on that, do we think it feels like the world is getting more anxious, right? Like,
it's because the future is becoming bigger, or it feels more menacing.
It feels like anxiety is a more and more common problem. Like, you're not surprised anymore when someone tells you that they have anxiety, or and it's academically true as well. I was talking to this guy, Thomas Curran from Bath University, who studies perfectionism, and he was saying that there has been a huge generational rise in perfectionism among kind of people around our age and younger, that it has and that then quite often leads to or triggers kind of anxiety disorders and depression and that kind of thing. And everybody thinks that their generation had a lot of pressures, right? But that they've demonstrably shown that these anxious perfectionistic tendencies are increasing in younger people as time goes by. Have you given much thought to it on a societal scale about why we suddenly have both these discussions about anxiety and this anxiety that just seems so constantly present in the public conversation? Is it?
I think looking at the world today, if you're not anxious, there's something wrong with you, really, because like just climate change in and of itself is going to change everything we hold to be normal very, very soon, and potentially even worse. I'm just getting really.
I'll ask something hopeful after this. I'll think of something.
It really is going to change everything, and we've all seen in the last 5 to 10 years. I've been reporting on climate change since I started as a journalist. I was an environment reporter, and I would do these big front page stories. Nothing would happen. Picture of Nelson flooding. Nothing. No reaction. And now it seems like people are starting to see it in their own backyards in terms of wasps and pests and odd flowerings at odd times of the year. Storm surges and flooding and no water and drought, and it just seems like it's become much more accepted that this is actually happening now, and that, should I have children? That's actually a really valid question that I have gone over for the last 5 years. What's going to happen? Will we even have... Oh, God, I'll stop. But will we even have an economy? But we have legitimate reason to be really anxious about the next 5, 10, 13, 15...
That people who, even those of us who were not already predisposed, it could start feeling...
And that's not even touching on social housing anxiety. And all the other stuff that's going on. Instability, I guess.
I think also, it's impossible not to mention just how much more visible our lives can be and shareable in terms of social media, and that creates an enormous amount of pressure as well. If you allow it into your life in a certain way, and of course a lot of young people really do, and it's central. I'm divided about the various helpfulnesses and burdens of social media. But I think it is pretty huge, and creating those anxieties.
I'm going to throw it open to questions in a second, but before that, I did want to ask, and I promised that I would ask something hopeful. Wendy, in your book, it seems like it's for a lot of people, writing can be quite anxiety-inducing, just like public speaking can or whatever. And it seems like for you, writing has helped you to reframe things or come alongside your anxiety in a way that for you sounded quite hopeful throughout your book. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes. That was the big revelation, was that just how therapeutic writing was, that I was used to a particular form of writing in my career, scholarly writing. I stopped being able to do that, like I stopped being able to read. But this was different. This was writing that felt completely different, and I've never experienced anything like that before, where just the act of writing, even if it was rubbish, but to write without the sort of pressures of CV building or the usual way I would approach writing if it was anything to do with my job, it just felt so freeing, and it gave me so much pleasure at a time when most other things weren't giving me any pleasure. So it was, I would really like if people can see that in the book, that just the act of writing, if people would sort of read the book and then go and write their own story, because it's just, I've always loved reading and certain kinds of writing, and I guess I've always been a frustrated creative writer, but it just gave me so much pleasure just to sit down and write and not know what was going to be on the page, or how 5 hours could go by, and whereas if I was writing a scholarly article or something, it would be like blood out of a stone, and all the research and all the footnotes had to be accurate and to be so careful about what you said, and this was just whatever was in my head. I was allowed to just put it on paper. Whether that ever saw the light of day or not was another thing, but the writing process was so, it was like a breath of fresh air for me.
I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions. Are there any questions? Otherwise, excellent. Hi.
I'm currently in therapy for the second time. The first time resulted in a book of contributor stories about an issue that was very shameful. And I noticed while I was writing it, I would carry my resource materials around without the title showing. I went on living my life, and now I've gone back into therapy because of a whole range of problems, including my husband's death. And I've got back to the stuff behind the original work, and that was childhood neglect. And it's led me to therapy now, which I'm having enormous trouble coping with. And I've got shame coming out of every single pore of me, because all these mental health problems, all these issues, all these difficulties in life have intrinsic shame, yet alone the shame you received in your early childhood. And I believe anxiety has got a lot to do with this. And shame is something we daren't talk about. We daren't actually be ashamed of our mental issues, because it's much better to stand on the stage or write a book than be ashamed. And I don't think I've really got to the nitty-gritty of shame yet. Last night I and another writer, a very profound writer, were talking about this problem, and I was trying to visualise what shame was. I was thinking about your problem with your knife in your face, and I've got mental images of all kinds of things of shame, and she's got an umbrella, and I haven't personally seen this written in writing. I know a lot of therapeutic stuff about shame, but nothing about the writing.
Have you read Brené Brown's book on shame? Have you read
of it?
Brené
A new
Brown's
Netflix special
book on shame?
Yeah.
I'll come and find
so
some.
good.
Yes,
It's so good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Has anyone had an example of dealing with either the shame of having written about it, or the shame of it having been received in a particular way? Is
definitely. Yeah, I feel shame over everything I've written about mental health. I think I've said it a couple of times, but you just cringe when you think of people reading it.
So what do you do with that?
Ashleigh's going to...
No, you can't.
You just accept that's where you were, and it's just the tools of getting over a mental health problem is just that was where I was, that's okay. It doesn't say anything about you personally, like everything, it's everyone else's issue. You just sort of, all the tools you learn when you're trying to deal with your head. You just apply it to whatever circumstance comes up. That is a really uncomfortable feeling. You just learn to deal with those with I think, a similar set of tools. But I love Brené Brown's book. It was brilliant.
Yeah, she actually, I just watched her amazing Netflix special about vulnerability, and for the first time I thought, well, shame does, it can be a gateway to being really vulnerable with yourself and with others, and that can be a great force of connection and creativity as well. But yeah, it's huge. I think shame kind of infuses so many of the choices we make, especially if you had a really difficult childhood and you have, what they call core shame, where you just feel apologetic for existing.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. No, that's okay.
No shame, that's fine.
Yeah. No apologies. Okay, so we've got one down there and we've got one there. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for that. That was really awesome. And my question, I guess, is about why it's taken us so long to realise the therapeutic value of actually discussing these issues. Like, it's just seems so obvious now, and it's so helpful to people. Whereas, when I grew up, it didn't get discussed, and people would die rather than discuss these issues. And yet now you guys are so much part of the solution, and the solution is as simple as actually articulating these things that people didn't talk about for years. And it's just, I guess, it's just progress, but I wondered if you had any thoughts on why it's taken us so long to arrive at such an obvious solution.
Yeah, growing up, I saw my two aunties last night who live in the area, and one of them was in Cherry Farm, and that was the big family secret. And the other one had schizophrenia, big family secret, And now they come and see me coming to an event talking quite happily about, and they're just kind of dumbfounded, like they're in their 60s and 70s, and it was so debilitating for them their entire lives, and they've felt so much shame over it all. But I actually don't know. I don't know why we talk more about it now. Is it New Zealand's growing up
the
more?
Consequences
the consequences
maybe.
Are less?
Yeah.
We've got a much more caring... Do we have a more caring culture? Like, have we got rid of some of the macho crap that New Zealand was imbued with for so long?
Do we feel more now like mental health isn't a personal, virtue failing?
It's actually just a chemical
it's a
upset.
medical problem.
Yeah, I mean, is that more research? When did it get into the DVM? The
DSM.
DSM. I was going to say DMV. When did it,
That's where you get your driver's license in America.
I don't actually know much about the medical history of when things began to be accepted as a health problem. But rather than, was it getting people out of the institutions into a community space that happened, that big health change, or... Yeah, do you guys
Perhaps a combination.
Yeah. But it's a good question. I actually don't...
It's a huge question.
Yeah, I mean, I just remember growing up with these whispered conversations about, schizophrenia and Cherry Farm.
Yeah. I remember in my town, the nearest mental health facility was Tokanui, and just that word had such stigma and just horror attached to it. And a friend of mine was there for a few months, and it was just kind of awful. When he was out, there seemed to be this aura of you shouldn't speak to him. He seemed infinitely damaged, which of course wasn't true, but just that stigma was so powerful that someone could just seem to be irrevocably of no use anymore,
broken.
And I'm so happy and relieved that has that to an extent, a large extent, that has changed.
Maybe we do have John Kirwan to thank. Maybe it's all down to him and Mike King.
Now there was. Okay, we have one more, and I know I'd said to you earlier that... Oh,
sorry, that was
we
me.
No, that was me before too.
I'm just wondering about stigma around medication, because personally for me, I've been, a lot of people say it's bad to put drugs into your body, and why would you need to do that? And I've been to my doctor and talked about it, and they really didn't want to prescribe anything, and just
there's no
having
shame.
something to trust. It doesn't I don't like doing it. I don't want to do it, but I probably need to, and just sleep would be a good thing to be able to get on a regular basis.
Was it quite deliberate for all of you to talk about medications in your work?
You need to strip away the shame of it. It just comes up over and over. Yeah. Some people, it takes a really long time to figure out what's going to help you as well, and medication can just help you just get over the hump of the trauma that's going on, and just sort of start to go to therapy and learn some other coping skills, and you may be on it for the rest of your life. You may, you've recently come off it, haven't you, and found that really challenging.
It was awful. I had to come back on, but I felt, after 6 months, I felt a tremendous amount of shame and almost grief as well for having to go back on medication because I couldn't cope without it. And I think like you, I just have never liked the idea of putting these things into my system. Also really don't like the side effects, which for me are quite profound. But I had to weigh that against the benefits, which are just immeasurable. I can function. I'm not constantly sobbing and raging and throwing furniture around. It got very bad. And I'm really grateful to that.
And getting sleep is huge. Like no one's saying if you're not sleeping.
You have to. I mean, and within 2 days you'll be just in a pit. Sleep. That was what killed both of our jobs. We just couldn't sleep, and luckily. But I take hay fever medication every day. Well, why is that not a problem?
I would just say that I think medication saved my life on 2 occasions.
Yeah.
So
same.
I'm medication free now, but the side effects some of them I don't really like, but I know that when you need it, it can really save your life.
Yeah, thanks very much. Our time together is unfortunately drawing to a close, including the extra 5 minutes that I stole at the end. But thank you very much for your questions, and I know they were all very personal, so I appreciate that. I will mention those numbers again. You can call 0800 Anxiety, best phone number ever, to get connected to services if you're looking for some help, or you can text 1737 if you just want to talk to someone like right now for a bit of chat. The authors will be at the signing table just outside, and if you need to grab a book or 3 or several before you get there, the UBS book table is also just outside. Thank you all so much for coming, especially first thing on a Saturday, and I would love for you all to give our panellists a very big thank you for their generosity and sharing.
This Dunedin Writers and Readers Festival recording was brought to you with funding from a Copyright Licensing New Zealand grant and with the support of OAR FM. The festival receives help from many corners, but we'd like to give special thanks to our major funders, Creative New Zealand, the Dunedin City Council, the Otago Community Trust and the Lion Foundation.
If this program has raised issues and made you worry about your or someone else's mental health, here are some ways to get help. The best person to contact is your GP or local mental health provider. However, if you or someone else is in danger or endangering others, call 111. If you need to talk to someone, the following free helplines operate 24/7. 1737 Need to Talk? Call or text 1737. Lifeline 0800 543 354. Youthline 0800 376 633 or text 234 between 8am and midnight. Depression Helpline 0800 111 757 and Samaritans 0800 726 666.